Just a quick one to welcome all our new subscribers to the channel. My name is Stewart Carroll and this is Drone Film Guide, the channel where we learn to fly like filmmakers. Now, believe it or not, I'm not actually that interested in drones. This is a filmmaking and photography channel. It just so happens drones are the devices that we use to get beautiful imagery. So if you want to learn how to get the best out of your Mavic Mini, you've come to the right place. With that in mind, a great starting point is to download a copy of our free ebook From Drone Zero to Drone Hero, 37 Drone Tips to Get You Flying Like a Filmmaker. We will also send you a free pre-flight checklist and a free shot list cheat sheet that we put together, in addition to some other goodies to thank you for joining us on this journey. So definitely a great starting point and a great free resource to get you up and running and up to speed as quickly as possible. Owning a drone doesn't make you a great photographer or a great filmmaker, it's just the start. So let's crack on with the review. Coming at this from a photography and a filmmaking perspective, let's cut to the chase and talk about picture quality. You saw the intro. Looked great? I thought it looked amazing. For such a cheap drone with a tiny sensor, 40 megabits per second bitrate, 2.7K, no 4K, outstanding results. Now, just a quick one, we buy this with our own money. We don't get given drones, unfortunately. So our opinions are our own. I have no hidden agenda here. I'm going to get to some negatives in a second, but for a drone of this price, size, all that kind of stuff, absolutely fantastic. I would much rather have a high quality 2.7K image than a low quality 4K image. So in that respect, I don't really care about the resolution. The 2.7K is plenty of resolution, and apart from anything else, we can't complain about not having 4K. If you want 4K, buy a more expensive drone. If you want a faster car, buy a more expensive car. You can't complain about that. It's not a downside, it's just not a feature because it's a cheap drone. So that's on the subject of video. As for photos, you might know that we don't have the capacity for shooting RAW here, so be it. It just means we need to use our head a little bit because we can't just shoot anything we want and then completely manipulate the colours in post, having not given any thought to it at the time of capture. The photos are very, very crisp, and I particularly enjoyed taking loads of photos and putting them all together as a panorama. Because we have a new app here, the DJI Fly app, I think it's called, streamlined version with far fewer features on it compared with DJI Go 4, obviously a deliberate attempt. First of all, to simplify the process for beginners who are buying this drone, and second of all, to not cannibalize the more expensive drones like the Mavic Air or the Mavic 2. We don't have a lot of the features like panoramas and HDR mode and auto exposure bracketing and all that kind of stuff, but it doesn't stop you doing it in post. So I created some stunning panoramas up in Glencoe with this, just by taking photos, bang, 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 and putting them together manually. In terms of real-time frame rates, we have two options, 25 frames per second and 30 frames per second. I'm sitting in the UK. In Europe, in a PAL region, we use 25 frames per second for television and cinema as the standard here. In an NTSC region like the States, however, you're typically offered two real-time frame rate options, 24 frames per second and 30 frames per second, which I do acknowledge is a little bit confusing. And here I do have a little bit of an issue, because if I was shooting in America, I would want to shoot on the cinema standard, which is 24 frames per second. I would not want to shoot on the television broadcast standard, which is 30 frames per second. We have a video explaining the history of frame rates you can check out, but that is my conclusion on that one, and it's one shared by Hollywood. So who am I to question that? Now, unlike the subject of more resolution where you need a better processor and all that kind of stuff, if they've given us 25 frames per second here in Europe, there surely can't be any reason why they didn't give you 24 frames per second in the States, other than a deliberate attempt to restrict the functionality of this drone. I think that's a little bit annoying, I have to say, especially since there's an inconsistency there, given that we can shoot 25 frames per second, the cinema standard, and in America you can't. As for setting your exposure, the brightness of the image, again, because this is targeted at entry-level users, everything is simplified as much as possible. So for video, auto exposure is the default. You cannot adjust the shutter speed to manually set exposure. Now, when I heard about that for the first time, I thought, well, the drone is pointless, absolutely useless. If you have followed us on the channel, we do not recommend setting auto exposure. It doesn't look good. You don't want to see the exposure change during filming. Under 99.9% of all scenarios, you want to set a manual exposure that is fixed, that does not change. So as I said, I thought this was just a pointless drone on the basis that it was always going to be on auto exposure for video. However, and I shall come to this in another video, you have a sneaky little button there called Auto Exposure Lock. What you can do is you can set the exposure you like. You can actually dial in a little EV compensation, so you can make it brighter or darker, and then you can press the auto exposure lock, and that locks in the exposure, which means that no matter where you fly that camera, the exposure will not change, which I think is fantastic. And that actually does away with almost all of my concerns about not being able to set a manual shutter speed in video mode. So if that didn't make any sense to you, don't worry, I'll get into that at a later date. There will be no ND filters from what I can tell for this, so there'll be no way of getting down to your 1/50th of a second shutter speed for the nice motion blur that the eye is accustomed to seeing. But unlike a Mavic 2 Pro, for example, if you shoot video on a 1,000th of a second shutter to get the light down so you can get a proper exposure, and because you don't have ND filters, you get that kind of jaggy high shutter speed look, which I find quite off-putting. It doesn't seem to happen here. Everything seems to be smoothed out a little bit. If you're flying close to the ground, you don't get that kind of jaggy look. It does look quite smooth, like there is motion blur there, which is strange because this thing must be shooting at a high shutter speed to get the light down hitting that sensor so that the image isn't completely overexposed. So again, super impressed with the picture quality. I really am. I'm not just saying that. Very, very good. And you saw some of those shots in the intro. They looked amazing. As for photography, you can set a manual exposure. Personally, I just set it to auto exposure and then just dial in a little bit of EV compensation if I think the auto has set it too bright or too dark. I'm going to get into all of that in a different video because although this is super simple, I think there's a few things that I can help you with there to get better video and photography from this drone. Finally, on the subject of picture quality, you don't have a manual white balance, which again I thought was absolutely criminal when I heard about that. You do not want to see your white balance change when you're filming. You know, the image goes from a little bit orangey to a little bit bluey depending on what the drone thinks is the right white balance. That's bonkers. But what I would say from having flown it a lot is that I pretty much don't think I ever saw the white balance change whilst filming, so it's not something that you need to stress about. So I wouldn't not buy it because of that if you're a slightly more experienced user expecting to be able to set a constant white balance. Moving on to some other features, it is obviously light, small and easy to use. So joy to use in that respect. I mean, what a luxury to have a drone in your pocket that you can just take out, stick on the ground, take off and get some great footage like I've just described. The flip side is it feels cheap. And this is really not built to last. That is not going to do well if it hits something. Now you could say, who cares if the results are great, because as I've shown you, the results can be great from this drone. But I will not be surprised if pretty quickly the landscape is littered with Mavic Mini parts. There's no obstacle avoidance on this. On my very first flight, because I'm a complacent, seasoned old campaigner when it comes to drones, I flew this thing backwards at full speed and missed my car by that much. Pretty stupid, but I mean, maybe if you're inexperienced, you're going to be a bit more careful and a little bit less complacent, or maybe the other way around, you're more likely to have an accident. It's just something to think about. You need a renewed sense of awareness because you don't have anything stopping you just flying that into your face when you're taking off or catch landing, flying it backwards into a telephone mast or something like that. So I do miss the obstacle avoidance, and if I was doing this more from a, let's say, a kind of real estate or kind of inspection perspective where you want to get quite up close to some physical, albeit static object, it is quite nice to have that safety net of obstacle avoidance. So do be careful when you're flying this. Battery life is very good. It's a treat to have 25-minute flight time on such a small drone. One thing I did find very strange, however, is that it takes an extraordinary amount of time to charge. I don't know why. Maybe you know more about it than me, charging through the USB cable directly into the back of the drone. I use a 12-volt power supply in the car to boost the batteries, just out the cigarette lighter. Used it for all our drones, and the big batteries that you get on a Phantom 4, the big batteries that you get on a Mavic 2, you can get them charged from 25% all the way up to full in about an hour, which is very, very practical and saves you a lot of money on batteries, I have to say. With this, I don't know, I didn't even time it. It took 2-3 hours to charge. Let me know your experiences on that one, but it is something to keep in mind because I'm not in the business of buying DJI's extremely expensive replacement batteries. So I like to find ways of keeping the cost down in that respect, and that's quite limiting if it does take 2 or 3 hours to charge this thing in your car. The Wi-Fi transmission was pretty good, I must say. I was comfortably able to get it about 300-400 meters away, which is very much the limit of visual line of sight, I should add, on a tiny little drone like this. The picture would start to break up, which is not ideal for cinematic moves if you're in the middle of something. But still, you can't complain. It's a Wi-Fi transmission system. Obviously, it's nowhere near the kind of transmission that you get OcuSync 2.0 with a Mavic 2, for example. But on the whole, I found the Wi-Fi transmission quite impressive. Second in importance to picture quality, to me at least, is cinematic control while flying. Being able to get nice smooth arcing maneuvers, rotations, gimbal tilts, all that kind of stuff. That's what matters for me for the video side of things when flying drones. And I was very pleased by and large with the way this performs. It's very smooth to fly, as smooth as any of the other drones. The feedback on the sticks is okay. Even the controller, I have to say, feels quite cheap. The spring in the sticks here is not the same as the Mavic 2 controller. They've just changed things just to make this a slightly less enjoyable flight experience, I should say, if you're quite used to the more expensive drones. But again, it's very cheap, and that's not a criticism, it's just a fact. You have positioning mode, sports mode, same as all the other drones, and you also have a cinematic C mode. I think it stands for cinematic mode, which smoothens down the yaw motion and makes it much easier to get nice rotations. So in terms of that level of flying, great, only good things to say. It is worth mentioning that what I really miss on this drone is an upward tilt limit of 30 degrees on the gimbal. The camera will not tilt up beyond horizontal. It's a problem for a couple of reasons, because if I'm filming mountains, for example, I want to tilt up ever so slightly just to be able to get the top of the mountain more comfortably in the frame. Also, a classic maneuver is the tilt reveal, flying forwards on the right stick and then just tilting up to reveal the landscape. The problem that you've got is because you have a hard stop there at 0 degrees, you have to be an absolute expert at just stopping that gimbal wheel just before you get to the horizon line. Otherwise, you're going to get a hard stop and it's going to completely ruin your shot. So there's no room for maneuver there. I think that's quite disappointing if I'm honest. The way I get around that is by flying backwards, starting to tilt the gimbal down, because it's a lot smoother to ease into the move than it is to ease out of it. And then you can reverse that in post and the drone is flying forwards, tilting up. Is it a criticism? I don't know. It's just an observation that does matter to me when I'm pulling off some more cinematic flight moves. Finally, I need to point out that this is not a powerful drone. It gets pushed about in the wind with these tiny little motors. It weighs nothing. It's completely understandable. The gimbal stabilizes everything, so there's no problem there. The bigger concern for me was that I nearly lost it on the first day of flying it. I've got a video on that as well. You can check the link to that. It wasn't windy, and I couldn't get this thing back. I did eventually by bringing it down and flying it backwards and wrestling with it, but I did get a bit disorientated, and with less experience, I think, in all honesty, I'd have lost this. So, you need to be very, very mindful of that. It does not have the power of drones you may have flown before, so don't just stick it 120 meters up into the air. It can be very windy up there if it's not windy on the ground. Just get to understand its limitations first before you get too ambitious with it. That concludes my summary of the Mavic Mini, and I think it's fair to say that I am quite the fan. Yes, there are some limitations that you need to be aware of, but cinematic control and picture quality are the most important for me, and by and large, they exceed all expectations in that respect. So yeah, I'm very pleased. This will be a backup drone, or if I'm off on some big adventure, or maybe I'll take it on holiday because I can't be bothered packing up the Mavic 2 Pro. For beginners, starter drone, absolute no-brainer. Of course, this is the drone for you. For intermediates as well, probably yes, this is also a good option. For advanced users, obviously not. Get a Mavic 2 Pro or a Mavic 2 Zoom. But different drones for different people, and this is going to tick a lot of boxes for a lot of people. If you want to shortcut your path to photography and filmmaking greatness, do get yourself a copy of our free ebook, in addition to the other goodies that will follow your way if you get yourself one of those. Link in the description below. I've got a bunch more Mavic Mini videos coming now that we finally got our hands on one, so stay tuned for those. Subscribe to the channel, and we will see you next time here on Drone Film Guide.